Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. This is a recent reads video wherein I talk about the books that I have been reading of late. I try to keep it contiguous with the previous recent reads video so that I encompass everything that I've been reading. In this case, I'll take it a step further and also talk a little bit about some things I am not reading. My objective is not to go into great detail about any of the books, and certainly not to give a review. So the first mentionable since the last recent reads video was Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds, although I read it in a graphic novel format with the illustrations being done by Danica Novgorodoff, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. Now, since I posted a video about it a little while ago, since I posted that, I did get a copy of the book itself. It's a compilation of poems, basically. So a group of poems forming a cohesive narrative unit. And there was a little bit of material discarded from the text version in the making of the comic book, which I sadly cannot show you. But alas, I found that all of the material that was discarded in the making of the comic book was something that could easily be lived without. So in that regard, I think that the comic book version was better than the book version. Now, this is not really a unique phenomenon. I was just thinking today in a different context about Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, which you may recall, you probably don't know unless you're of my age group, was turned into a Lionel Bart musical in the 60s. And I read Oliver Twist just last year, and I found that absolutely everything that Carol Reed or whoever wrote the screenplay was, everything that they chucked from the novel for the making of the movie was well chucked. And then when I read the novel last year and came across all of these extra scenes, they really felt out of place. It felt like Dickens needed a good editor, and I wish somebody would compile a movie version, so to speak, of the text and just get rid of that extraneous matter. Not really. I don't believe in tampering with a long dead author's texts. But so the feeling about the comic book being superior to the book is not really unique. I believe Carol Reed's movie is probably superior to Charles Dickens' novel. Although I will not go out on that limb. I have not seen the movie. Definitely the stage play, which I have seen. Lionel Bart's stage play is not quite congruous with the film. And in fact, you know, as with, say, Rent, when it came time to make a movie of it, certain changes had to be made. I think Carol Reed was probably a superior director to Chris Columbus, but nevertheless, let me not keep going off on these tangents. I can't remember explicitly what material was left out of the comic book version of Long Way Down, but one thing that I remember was the author every so often during the text intersperses little anagrams. And so a word, and these are not from the text. I no longer remember the ones he used. So, you know how live the letters can be transposed and it can become evil or you know, some other things, or stop and pots, that kind of thing. And he closes with the final anagram. I wish I could think of an anagram for poser. Obviously, the immediate anagram that comes to mind is prose. And so you wonder why the author wants the reader to think of that. But needless to say, in the comic book version, all of that was done away with, and a good riddance to it, as I say. I do recommend Long Way Down as a comic book, and I am sure a youngster would derive benefit out of the book also. Partially even just as an introduction to the poetic form, sort of expanded or extended, if you will. Now, where I talk about what I'm not going to read, I ordered from the library a copy of an earlier book by the illustrator of Long Way Down, Danica Novgorodoff. And the art, she's an incredible artist. I mean, I think you can just see from this opening scene, this is very much to the taste of the other comic book. But where I fall off is the characters are all done in a very caricature-ish style, which is perfectly acceptable in comic books, I realize. But so you get this kind of thing. The characters in Long Way Down were presented in a much more photorealistic manner, if you will, and I prefer that very much. So just looking at the illustrations, while I recognize the talent, the style of this piece is not to my taste. Now, another thing, since I'm talking about comic books, which I decided not to read, is this marvelous tome, which I heard about on a video done by Troy Trada. And it, by all accounts, by all markings that I could apply to it, it just appears to be magnificent. But it made me realize that I believe the comic book format is not for me. So it opens with a giving birth scene, and the artwork is spectacular. So there you go. And I read a little bit, but it turns out it contains a lot of fantasy elements, and I'm not really a fan of fantasy. You know, there's a character in here with a whole bunch of eyes. I just saw it, and now I can't find it to show to you. Well, let me just, yeah, you know, these people are supposedly different species, so he has these horns or whatever that go around his head. So visually or graphically, it's of interest, but as a storytelling feature, I find it kind of silly, and that's why I've never, I suppose, been some zooming going on here, a Star Trek fan, or even very much a Star Wars fan. You know, you have these different creatures with different features, but they're all basically just humans. It reminds me of the Winnie the Pooh stories where you have animals, but they just walk and talk like humans, whereas real animals like octopuses with, 8 different brains, are completely different from people. And I find that more interesting than fantastical creatures or even animals that are merely humans in disguise. I think the dog just got zoomed into by the zooming cat. So that was that. This looks like a wonderful story if you are into fantasy. It's quite a tome. There are no page numbers, but I think you can see. So I am very grateful that Troy put this to my attention. It's not my cup of tea. So let me get on back to what I did read, starting with Troubles by J.G. Farrell. Now, this took me longer to read than I expected, and the basic scenario is it follows a returning soldier. Well, my memory on everything grows very sketchy the more intervening time lies between the reading and doing other things. So the main character is, I believe, in a lot of ways like the author, an Englishman of Irish descent. And so the plot centers around his visiting an old hotel in Ireland, which is owned by the father of the woman that he supposes he is going to marry. And everything that ensues. And it takes into account the Irish Troubles, which at first begin only as the slightest intimation of a backdrop. Through the book, you follow the characters essentially, and as the story progresses, more and more the political happenings in Ireland intrude upon their little bastion of decaying culture. I loved the inclusion of animals in this story. Throughout the novel is peopled with cats and dogs. Occasionally bad things happen to them as to people, but I can't recall another novel that I've read that takes into account so much of the animal kingdom, and I appreciated it, and it was refreshing. So immediately done with this book, I decided to proceed into Farrell's next volume in the trilogy. It's a colonialism trilogy. The Siege of Krishnapur, India, 1857, the year of the Great Mutiny, when Muslim soldiers turned in bloody rebellion on their British overlords. So I started it, and it struck me as good. I have to disturb a cat here because there was a quote that I wanted to mention. Bricks are undoubtedly an essential ingredient of civilization. One gets nowhere at all without them. I like that kind of little statement when it's interjected into a text. I have no doubts that this is a good novel, and I hope to be undertaking this very soon. But because it took me so long to get through the first, mainly because of a lot going on in life, and because I read something online that suggested that all three of Farrell's colonial novels involve almost equivalent or parallel plot dynamics, I decided to hold off on it for a bit. So, as in the case of Troubles, where you have an outsider coming to an old colonial bastion, as I say, all of his colonial novels supposedly have the same setup. In this case, it being India 1857. And I thought, I just don't want to read the same thing again. And it took me so long that when I slate Krishnapur, I hope to do it at a time when I know I'm going to have better time and I can just knock through it. So I set that one aside. And from here on, it's what I did read. Next, I read Boulder by Eva Baltasar, translated by Julia Sanches. Now, I bought this at the charity bookshop. It has 2 August 2022 on it, and it's not for sale. I did buy it, but it was from the charity, so obviously the first possessor of it did not sell it. And I enjoyed this story very much. I will have to go back to it. I've talked about it here and there. It really raised to the fore of my ruminating this notion that novels really always present the perspective of the colonizer and that they are a weapon of colonialism. Now, I'm not going to talk about that. These thoughts as yet remain very incoherent in my mind, but now that they are there, they are staying there. And it's a very short read. I think it's less than 100 pages. And all of the pages, here we go, let's see. All of the pages have a lot of white space on them as well. So you're not even really getting 100 pages. It's a short story, I think, to be fair. But it's very interesting. You follow the foibles of 2 women as they decide to bring a baby into this world. And I will say no more about the story. Then I read A Month in the Country, and this I loved, especially on the heels of this. I resented this because the characters were so, what is the word solipsistic? They're characters who only think about themselves. Their thought never reaches out to another person. And it grated on me after a while. The story was fine, but after that I was yearning for characters that have a little bit more going on, a little bit more substance to them, and I found it in this. It only occurred to me this morning that the plot is somewhat similar to Troubles, in that we have a retired serviceman or an ex-serviceman repairing to a place in the country, if you will, and details his time there, the account of his time. In this case, the man is or has been hired to restore an old church painting, a mural that's up on the wall. Clean it, basically, clean off all of the overlay. And I liked very much the fact that we had characters who were enmeshed in cultural content, if you will. Sorry about that. You saw the perp just before that happened. It's so hard to keep any kind of focus around here. And when I say that I could easily see myself just giving up reading altogether, that is why or would be so easy to just take leave of this whole world of human culture, which ultimately is tepid and flat and stale in contrast to anything at all in the natural kingdom or natural world or natural community of creatures that we have around us. So that is for another time. Loved this book. It's very short. I think possibly I was a little bit disappointed in the ending, but that has totally distracted me, and I can't remember what possibly I wanted to say. And the next one, finally, I went back to Eileen Chang, Lust Caution. This is a collection of short stories. Now, it's very short also. So it and A Month in the Country are, for veteran readers, a one-day read. This took me slightly longer just because of, again, time constraints. And I'm very glad to return to this, and it once again reinforces that Eileen Chang effectively has supplanted W. Somerset Maugham in my mind as my iconic short story writer. Now that may change yet again, but it's an interesting thing going from being very much a non-reader to becoming a reader. And I realize the faster you go, the more you have to let go of things. And so W. Somerset Maugham has been in my consciousness as sort of a monument, a benchmark, an icon for many, many years, sort of the paragon of short story writers for me. That was in large respect, I realize now, because I wasn't reading that many short stories. I just didn't know. So when you are existing in a vast sea of ignorance, you reach out for what you can. And I loved Maugham's stories, but the honest to God's fact of the matter is I will probably not be returning to them ever again. And I have had that driven home with absolute finality with this. Now, it looks if I want to proceed with any more Eileen Chang, I have to go into novels. I would like to have a big omnibus of short stories if she had done so, but I don't know what the full extent of her work is, and it only seems to have been gotten translated piecemeal in the last decade or so. This, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect this only came out upon the heels of the Ang Lee movie, which I saw when it came out. Now I forget, 2007, could it be? And it raises questions in my mind. I think the story is vastly superior to the Ang Lee movie. It's, I think, a 30-page story. And when I finished the story, I could not remember the movie at all. And so I talked about it a little bit with my partner. We had gone to see it when it first came out. And it made me, as we discussed it, I remembered more and more. I would go and see it in a second if I could again. And should the occasion arise, I will. But I realized that, when a Charles Dickens novel is made into a movie, they have to cut out a lot of material. In the case of the musical movie Oliver, I thought what they cut out was just. A short story tends to lend itself to movie making, I think. And in that respect, this story, Lust Caution, was very ripe for being made into a movie. But having read the story, I realized that the story is mainly one scene, a riveting scene of suspense, I guess you would call it. And it's preceded by some little bit of background. And what I believe Ang Lee had to do to make a movie out of it was to flesh out all of that antecedent material, to give it much more body, so that, you know, whereas something could just be mentioned in a couple of sentences, he gave you the whole picture. And as far as a movie, it's watchable enough, that kind of thing, but it gave me the sense of filler or padding. So these stories mostly all take place in Shanghai. I believe the last book that I read, how bad I am with these names, Love in a Fallen City, were mostly set in Hong Kong. But these are all, nevertheless, during the wartime era. And I don't think they carry the breadth of the fictional pieces chosen for that other book. So I would recommend that as a starting place before this. But if you, like me, like Chang's writing, you don't have a lot of options, at least insofar as short stories go. I will possibly go into the novels next. Now, with W. Somerset Maugham, I did so. I read a couple of his novels and did not find that they rose to the quality of his short stories. I doubt I will go back at this point to try another novel by him, but I will try to get some kind of novel by Eileen Chang. A lot of them are done in this publishing house, New York Review of Books. Well, I don't have the copy of Love in a Fallen City handy, but that exists in a New York Review of Books edition. So I've gone blathering on, and just wanted to keep you up to date. I'm at about the half-hour mark, and the next thing that I am starting is People of the City, and hopefully, if I do another recent reads video, it shall begin with this. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.